The last thing I remember from my first life is the smell of jet fuel and my mother's perfume, and the fact that she didn't hug me goodbye, she just watched, hands folded, eyes dry, like she was dropping off a piece of luggage she'd been meaning to throw away for years. I was 23 years old, and my own family had me escorted, onto a one-way flight to a country I had never lived in, with a suitcase of wrong-sized clothes and a phone that already canceled the service on. No warning, no explanation, just a manila envelope with a name I didn't recognize on the return address and the words, "This is better for everyone. Everyone. Not me. Everyone." I didn't know it then, but that flight wasn't just abandonment. It was a cover-up, and the name in that envelope, it wasn't a distant relative being kind. It was proof of something so ugly, so calculated, that if I had found it before I boarded that plane, none of them would have had time to run. But I didn't find it in time. I found it after I died, and when I actually came back, I didn't come back crying. I didn't come back begging. I came back with a name that made boardroom doors open and powerful men go quiet. A name they created, a name they buried, a name they never once imagined I would find, let alone own. They shipped me away so I would disappear. Instead, I became the one thing they spent their whole lives pretending didn't exist. If you think you know where this story goes, you don't. Stay with me, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what comes next? You are not going to want to miss a single second. Part 1. Let me take you back to before the flight, before the envelope, before everything I thought I knew about my family turned to ash in my hands. My name was Nora Calloway. I'll explain that part later. I grew up in a house that looked like a magazine cover. Wide windows, manicured lawn, a mother who wore pearls to breakfast, and a father who never raised his voice because he never had to. He had people for that, people who delivered bad news quietly, who made problems disappear without anyone ever having to get their hands dirty. I was the oldest daughter, and for most of my life, I believed that meant something. I believed it right up until the morning I found the documents. It was an accident. I wasn't supposed to be in my father's office. Nobody was, ever. That was the first rule of the Calloway house. But the cleaning crew had left the door cracked, and I saw the corner of a folder on his desk with my name on it. Not my full name, just Nora. In red ink, like a warning label. I should have walked away. I know that now. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a legal transfer of guardianship. My name, being handed, signed over, to a man named Gerald Ashworth, based in London. A man I had never heard of, never met. The document was dated 6 months prior. 6 months they had been planning this for half a year while I sat at that same dinner table, past the bread basket, and asked my mother how her day was. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the folder. But what stopped my breath entirely, what made my vision go white at the edges, was the single line typed at the bottom of the last page, under a section titled, "Reason for Transfer." It said, "To protect the integrity of the Calloway estate and eliminate risk of disclosure." Eliminate risk of disclosure? I was not a daughter being helped. I was a liability being removed. I put the folder back exactly as I found it. I walked to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I did not cry. Not because I was strong, but because I was so far past shock that my body didn't know what to do with the feeling yet. It just went numb. Completely, totally numb. That night at dinner, my father asked me to pass the salt. My mother talked about a charity gala. My younger sister, Camille, showed everyone a dress she'd bought, and I sat there, smiling, chewing, nodding, knowing that every single person at that table already knew I was leaving. Every single one of them had known before I did. That was the first death, right there, at that dinner table. In the middle of a normal Tuesday night, the second death came 11 months later. In London, in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and silence, from a condition the doctors called sudden, but that I would later learn was anything but. But here is what they did not count on. Here is what every single person who signed that document, who smiled at that dinner table, who waved goodbye at that airport without a single tear. Here is what none of them ever stopped to consider. What if whatever they were hiding from me I found anyway? What if the man they sent me to, Gerald Ashworth, wasn't just a guardian? What if he was the one person alive who knew exactly what the Calloway family had done? And what if, before I took my last breath in that hospital, he handed me a file that made every piece of my life suddenly, horribly, make sense? I died knowing the truth, and that truth is what brought me back. But what was in that file? That's where everything changes. I came back on a Wednesday. I know that sounds strange, but when you die and then suddenly you're not dead, when you open your eyes and the ceiling above you is not a hospital ceiling but the ceiling of your childhood bedroom, with that same water stain in the corner, shaped like a crescent moon, the first thing your brain grabs onto is something small, something ordinary, something that proves you are real. It was a Wednesday. I was 19 years old and I had 4 years before the flight. I lay completely still for 11 minutes. I counted, because the Nora who woke up in that bed was not the same Nora who had gone to sleep 19 years ago. I had every memory, every document, every word Gerald Ashworth had whispered to me in that hospital room. Before the machines went quiet, I had the truth, all of it, sitting inside me like a lit match. And I had 4 years to decide exactly where to strike. The old me would have confronted them immediately. Stormed downstairs, slammed the folder on the breakfast table, screamed until someone cracked. The old me was emotional, reactive, and completely readable. That's exactly why they'd been able to maneuver around me so easily. The new me understood something the old me never did. Panic is loud, but power is silent. So I walked downstairs that Wednesday morning, sat at the table, and smiled at my mother like nothing in the world was wrong. She looked up from her coffee and blinked. "You're up early, couldn't sleep," I said. "Good morning, Mom." She almost looked confused, like even that small warmth from me was slightly off, slightly different from what she expected. She studied my face for just a half-second too long before looking back at her cup. Good, let her feel it, that small, unexplainable discomfort. She didn't know what it was yet. But I did. It was the feeling of being watched by someone who finally knows exactly who you are. I spent the first 3 weeks doing nothing dramatic. I watched, I listened, I started quietly documenting. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be found. Just mental notes, patterns, timelines, who called my father after dinner. Which conversations stopped the moment I walked into a room. How my mother's eyes moved to Camille whenever someone mentioned the Calloway estate. Camille, my younger sister, sweet, soft-spoken, golden-haired Camille, who everyone adored and no one ever questioned. In my first life, I had loved her without hesitation. She was my little sister. I protected her, defended her, shared everything with her. I told her things I told no one else. In my second life, I looked at her differently. Because Gerald Ashworth's file had included a phone record, one single printed page, a log of calls made from our home landline to a private legal office in Manhattan. The calls started 2 years before my guardianship transfer was finalized. Routine, weekly, sometimes twice a week. The account holder for that legal office? It wasn't my father. The account was registered under a trust established in the name of the youngest Calloway daughter, to be activated on her 25th birthday, contingent on one condition. The condition was me, specifically. My absence. I had always believed my parents were the architects of my removal. And they were involved, yes, but they weren't the ones who initiated it. They weren't the ones who first made the call. I was shipped away so Camille could inherit everything that was originally meant to be split between us. But Camille didn't just benefit from my disappearance. She had asked for it, my little sister, the one I tucked in at night, the one I fought for at every family dinner, the one who cried the longest at the airport when I left, sobbed, dramatically, loudly, with her head on my mother's shoulder. She had been crying because she won, and she had done it all before she turned 17. But here's what Camille didn't know, what none of them knew. Gerald Ashworth wasn't just a guardian my father had hired. Gerald Ashworth was a Calloway, and he had left everything to me. Let me tell you something about secrets that have been buried for decades. They don't stay buried, they fester, they grow roots in the dark, and those roots spread further than anyone ever planned. Until one day, the ground above them starts to crack, and everyone standing on top suddenly has nowhere safe to put their feet. Gerald Ashworth was my father's older brother. That sentence alone should tell you everything about how deep this went. But let me give you the full picture, because the details are what make it devastating. My grandfather, Richard Calloway, had 2 sons, my father, James, and Gerald, who was 7 years older. By every right of birth order, by every tradition the Calloway family operated on, Gerald should have inherited the estate, the business, the name, all of it. He was firstborn, he was sharp, ambitious, and by every account I found later, he was the better man. But Gerald made one mistake that Richard Calloway could never forgive. He fell in love with someone the family didn't approve of. A woman with no money, no connections, no last name that opened doors. He chose her over the family's arrangement. He chose love over legacy. And Richard Calloway rewrote his will overnight. Gerald was cut out completely, erased. The family spent the next 2 decades pretending he didn't exist. No holidays, no phone calls, no acknowledgement at funerals or weddings. My father never once mentioned him. My mother acted like the word Gerald was profanity. I grew up 23 years without ever knowing this man existed. But Gerald knew I existed. He had watched from a distance my entire life. Because his wife, the woman the family rejected, she had a younger sister. And that younger sister had eventually, quietly, married into a different family. A family that did charity work. A family that once attended a Calloway Foundation gala. A gala where Gerald had stood in the back of the room and watched a 7-year-old girl with his brother's eyes drag her mother toward the dessert table and laugh so loudly the whole room turned to look. That little girl was me. He told me all of this in the hospital. Slowly, carefully, like a man who had rehearsed it 1,000 times and was terrified of getting even one word wrong. He said he had spent years building something, quietly, legally, completely outside of my father's reach. A second empire, built from nothing, from pure stubborn refusal to be erased. And when it became something real, when it became something that could rival the Calloway estate in value, he had made his decision. It would go to me. All of it, not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because I was the only Calloway who had ever been treated the way he had, disposed of, transferred, removed like an inconvenience, and he believed that the people who survived that deserved to be the ones who inherited. But here is the twist that made my blood run cold, even in my second life, even knowing what I already knew. Gerald had tried to contact me before the flight. He had sent a letter to our house, addressed to me directly, with a return address and a phone number and 2 words at the bottom of the page that would have changed everything if I had ever seen them. Call me. I never received that letter. Someone in that house had intercepted it. And when I went looking, when I used every quiet, careful resource I had built in those first months of my second life, I found the proof I needed. The letter had been opened, read, and destroyed, not by my father. Not by my mother. The fingerprints, metaphorically speaking, led back to the one person in that house who had access to the mail before anyone else. The one person who always offered, cheerfully, helpfully, without being asked. Camille, she was 15 when she destroyed that letter. 15 years old, and she already knew exactly what she was doing. But what I discovered next, what was hidden underneath even that, made Camille look like a minor player in a game she hadn't even designed, because someone had told her to do it. Someone who had known about Gerald long before any of us should have. And that someone was still in the house, still at the dinner table, still smiling at me every single morning. My mother had a best friend named Diane. Diane Hartwell, polished, soft-spoken, always the first to arrive at every Calloway dinner party and the last to leave. She brought flowers every time she visited. She remembered everyone's birthday. She called my mother her person, her soul sister, the woman she trusted more than anyone alive. And my mother said the same about her, right up until I showed her exactly what Diane had been doing for the past 20 years behind her back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you how I got there. By the time I was 21, 2 years before the original flight, I had built something my family didn't know existed. Quietly, while attending the university they selected for me, while playing the role of the obedient eldest daughter, while smiling at Sunday dinners and asking polite questions about the foundation gala, I had made contact with Gerald's legal team, not dramatically, not with confrontation. I simply walked into their Manhattan office one afternoon, sat down across from a woman named Patricia Cole, Gerald's head attorney, and said 7 words. "I know who I am. Let's talk." Patricia stared at me for a long moment, then she closed the folder on her desk, folded her hands, and said, "We've been waiting 3 years for you to find us." Gerald had instructed his team that if I ever made contact on my own, without being prompted, without being told, it would confirm everything he believed about me. That I was observant enough, that I was ready, that I had survived the family's pressure without being broken by it. It was a test, and I had passed it in my first life too late. ID only found them after the flight, after the hospital, after death. This time, I walked through that door 2 years early. Within 6 months, the paperwork was finalized. Gerald's estate, his company, his holdings, his properties across 4 states, was legally, irrevocably transferred into a private trust under a name I had chosen myself. Not Calloway, not anything they had given me, a name they had never heard. Ashworth, I became Nora Ashworth on paper while still living in that house as Nora Calloway. 2 identities, 2 worlds, one of them shrinking, one of them growing, and my family had absolutely no idea. Now, let me tell you about Diane. Patricia's team had done extensive background research before Gerald finalized his decision to leave everything to me. Part of that research included investigating why the family had moved so aggressively to remove me, who had first suggested the guardianship transfer, who had sourced Gerald's name as the guardian, because that detail had always bothered me. Why would my father send me to a brother he pretended didn't exist? Unless someone else had suggested it. Someone who knew Gerald existed when they shouldn't have. Diane Hartwell had been Gerald's girlfriend before my mother ever entered the picture. 15 years before my parents married, Diane and Gerald had been together for 3 years. She knew everything about him, his fallout with Richard, his exile, his stubbornness, his refusal to be bought out. And when Gerald eventually built his empire in silence, Diane had been watching, tracking, feeding information about his progress quietly, carefully, to the one person who would find it most useful. My father. She had spent 2 decades as my mother's best friend, while secretly acting as a financial informant, reporting Gerald's growing wealth back to James Calloway so my father could calculate the threat, plan around it, and ultimately use it. The plan to send me to Gerald wasn't just about removing me. It was about planting me. They believed that if I lived under Gerald's roof, became his ward, earned his trust, he would eventually include me in his estate. And when he died, whatever he left me would legally flow back into Calloway control because I was still, on paper, a Calloway dependent. They had used me as a financial trap, a slow, patient, long-game trap, designed to steal a dead man's empire through his own affection for a niece he never got to know. Except Gerald had known, he had seen it coming. Every single move. Which is why Head built the trust the way he did. Airtight, untouchable, with one clause that made it completely immune to Calloway interference. The clause that stated if anyone bearing the Calloway name, or connected to the Calloway estate by blood or marriage, attempted to contest, access, or claim any portion of the Ashworth Trust, they would trigger an automatic legal disclosure. A disclosure that contained 30 years of financial records. Records that proved my father had been laundering money through the Calloway Foundation for over a decade. The charity gala, the donor dinners, the tearful speeches about legacy and community, all of it. A machine. A beautifully decorated, publicly celebrated machine for moving dirty money. And my father had no idea that Gerald had been collecting that proof, piece by piece, year after year, just waiting for someone to make the wrong move. The moment Camille filed a legal inquiry challenging my trust, which she did 11 days after I stopped coming home for Sunday dinners, the disclosure triggered automatically. I didn't have to do a single thing. I just had to wait. And then I watched my father's phone light up at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, a number he didn't recognize. And I watched the color leave his face so completely that he looked, for the first time in my entire life, like a frightened old man. He looked up from his phone. And across the room, I was already looking at him. Not with anger, not with tears, just watching. Calm. Still. The way you look at something that no longer has any power over you. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Nora," he started. "Ashworth," I said quietly. "My name is Nora Ashworth, and you should probably call your lawyer." I picked up my coat, I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard the sound of a man whose entire life was beginning to collapse, and I felt nothing but clean, cold, absolute relief. But the best part? The part that I had saved. The final piece, the one move that would make everything they'd ever done completely, permanently irreversible? That came next morning, and it didn't come from me. It came from Diane. Diane called my mother at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting in my car outside their house when it happened. Not hiding, not lurking, just present. Deliberately, visibly present, because I wanted my mother to look out the window and see me there, calm and still, while her world came apart on the other end of that phone call. I had given Diane a choice the night before. I had gone to her home, knocked on her door, and when she answered, still in her robe, still holding a glass of wine, still wearing that practiced expression of warmth shed, spent decades perfecting, I had placed a single manila envelope on her doorstep. "Everything you told my father about Gerald is in there," I said. "Every communication, every payment he made to you in return." Patricia's team documented all of it. Diane's face did something interesting then. It didn't collapse immediately. It tried to hold, tried to calculate, the way people do when they are deciding whether to lie or surrender. Her eyes moved fast. To the envelope, to my face, to the street behind me, back to my face. "Nora, listen. I'm not here for an explanation," I said. "I'm here to give you a choice. You call my mother tomorrow morning and you tell her everything. Everything you did, everything you hid, everything you fed to my father for 20 years. Or Patricia files the civil disclosure by noon and you lose the Hartwell Consulting Firm, your license, and depending on how the DA reads the wire transfer records, possibly your freedom." She stared at me. "You're not bluffing," she whispered. "I never needed to," I said. And I walked back to my car. So there I was, 6:47 a.m., watching the light in the upstairs bedroom flicker on, watching my mother's silhouette appear at the window, phone pressed to her ear, one hand flat against the glass, watching the exact moment the woman who had raised me, managed me, erased me. The moment she finally understood the full shape of what had been done. Not just to me, to her, because Diane hadn't just betrayed me. She had spent 20 years manipulating my mother too, feeding her fear, steering her loyalty, quietly making sure Eleanor Calloway remained exactly where she was most useful. Isolated from the truth, dependent on a friendship that was never real, a woman kept warm and blind by someone who had been using her family as a financial chessboard since before I was born. My mother had not been an innocent. She had signed documents. She had looked away when looking away was easier. I will not rewrite her into a victim. But she had also been deceived in ways she didn't fully know. Until that morning, I saw her leave the window. 3 minutes later, the front door opened. She walked out in her robe, barefoot on the cold November steps, and she looked at me in my car with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the controlled, composed pearls-at-breakfast face, not the performance. Something raw and old and ashamed underneath all of it. She didn't walk toward me. I didn't get out. We just looked at each other across that distance for a long moment. And in that moment, I think we both understood that some things, once broken at the root, do not get rebuilt. They just get acknowledged. Finally, honestly, completely acknowledged. I gave her one small nod. Then I started the car. My father was arrested on a Thursday. 41 days later. The foundation's board dissolved within the week. Camille's trust, built entirely on the condition of my absence, was invalidated by the same legal team that had spent 3 years waiting for me to walk through their door. She lost everything she had spent her teenage years engineering, and gained nothing but the understanding that she had sacrificed her relationship with her sister for a future that evaporated the moment I came back. I did not attend any of the hearings. I did not give interviews. I did not post, perform, or celebrate publicly. I just lived under my name, my real name, the one I had chosen for myself in a quiet Manhattan office with Gerald's attorney watching me with something close to pride. Nora Ashworth, the Ashworth Foundation launched in the spring. Legitimate, clean, built to fund legal protection for young women pushed out of family estates by exactly the kind of manipulation that had once been used on me. Patricia ran the legal division, I ran everything else. Gerald never got to see it. But I think he knew it was coming. I think that's why he had waited, why he had collected every document, built every safeguard, and left everything to a niece he only ever watched from a distance. Because he recognized something in me that I hadn't yet recognized in myself. That I was the kind of person who survives the burial and comes back with a shovel. They shipped me away so I would disappear. But you cannot disappear someone who finally knows exactly who she is. You can only delay her, and delay, as my father learned in a federal courtroom on a cold Thursday morning, has a price. It always does.